Calling the Standing Committee on Transport, Infrastructure and Communities, meeting number 39. Welcome to everybody. Pursuant to Standing Order 1082, we are continuing study of the Navigation Protection Act. We have several witnesses with us today. Emma Liu, water campaigner from the Council of Canadians, welcome back. You didn't get your full time the last time, so we're trying to make sure that you have your opportunity this morning. And we have Adrian Davidson, Fulbright visiting researcher for the Centre for Canadian Studies at Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies. Thank you very much to both of you for being with us today. Ms. Liu, we'll go to you for very brief opening remarks, if you can just kind of comment on what you didn't get to finish the other day so that you have time to receive some questions from the committee members. Ms. Liu?
Great, thank you. Yes, good morning, everyone. So I just want to say thanks to the Standing Committee for inviting the Council of Canadians back. Appreciate the opportunity to continue raising the concerns that I'd started the other day. I guess I just want to flag, we had raised concerns about the lakes and rivers that remain unprotected in many of the communities that our 60 chapters are in. We also have many supporters that have expressed concerns about the projects that are threatening navigable waterways in their communities, and just wanting to raise particularly the approvals that the Trudeau government had put forward with the Trans Mountain pipeline and Line 3 pipeline recently. So Justin Trudeau had campaigned on restoring and strengthening many of the freshwater and but these approvals to these pipelines, as well as the Site C Dam, really raises some concerns about the government's commitment to protect waterways in Canada. And many of our chapters and supporters have expressed concerns about these projects threatening navigable waterways in their communities. As you likely know, the Trans Mountain pipeline crosses and threatens roughly 1,300 waterways. Excuse me. Oil spills like the one that happened on the Kalamazoo River impacted navigation in parts of the river, and nearby lake were closed for 2 to 3 years because of this spill. So just really, raising concerns about the potential of spills from the Trans Mountain pipeline and Line 3, and as well as the Energy East pipeline. So these projects were approved with weakened legislation put forward by the former Harper government, and seriously threaten local waterways which communities rely on for boating, fishing, recreation, local tourism. Local economies rely on healthy and navigable waterways. So just wanting to urge the Standing Committee to make recommendations to the federal government to restore and enhance protections for every lake and every river. Particularly, we're asking for a new clause that be developed so that potential spills or discharge of harmful substances are assessed for their impact on navigable waterways, and again underscoring the importance of respecting and implementing the human right to water, as well as the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. So I'll just leave it there. Thank you very much. Really appreciate the time.
Great. Thank you very much, Ms. Liu. Ms. Davidson?
Thank you very much, and thank you to the committee for inviting me to speak today. I'm speaking to you today with respect to a research project that I undertook in 2014 with colleagues at McGill University and at the University of Washington that investigated the changes to the Navigable Waters Protection Act. That paper was published in 2015 in the Canadian Journal of Fisheries and Aquatic Sciences. The changes to the NWPA received considerable public and political attention, particularly as it pertained to the potential environmental impacts. The NWPA never itself had an environmental mandate or role, though its relationship to environmental protection was constructed through the Canadian Environmental Assessment Act of 1992, which used the NWPA as a triggering mechanism. In 2012, the changes to SIA removed that triggering mechanism when it adopted the designated projects list. Meanwhile, the changes to the Navigable Waters Protection Act removed comprehensive federal oversight over waterway navigability through the creation of its Schedule A list of waters. So what has this meant for oversight? According to the SIA online registry, there were 2,400 projects, environmental assessment projects, conducted between 2003 and 2012 that were triggered by the Navigable Waters Protection Act. 58% of these projects were conducted on waterways that no longer receive protection under the Navigation Protection Act. Projects occurring on ocean basins, which remain on Schedule A, account for approximately 30% of those environmental assessment projects, while only 11.1% of projects occurred on lakes and rivers that today are included on Schedule A. So with respect to oversight, I think it's fair to say that we've seen a pretty dramatic decrease in federal project oversight on lakes and rivers in Canada. However, it is important to note that reducing NPA oversight does not necessarily mean that there is no federal oversight on a project. Projects requiring environmental assessment, if they appear on the designated projects list, may still occur on non-Schedule A waterways. And federal oversight might also be achieved through other legislation, such as the Fisheries Act. However, at this time, I don't have, and I believe the public does not have, a clear sense of what the gaps are under the new regulatory framework. The concurrent changes to the Fisheries Act in 2012 might have had a similar effect in reducing federal oversight, or alternatively, these parallel pieces of legislation may continue to work together to provide comparable levels. However, it's, at this point, I think, pretty unclear what that looks like. The Navigation Protection Act defines navigation with respect to recreation and commercial uses. How we think about navigation and what types of navigation are important had a major impact on the way in which the Schedule A list of lakes and rivers was defined. As best that we can tell from the information that we received through our ATIP requests, the Schedule A list of lakes was compiled through a fairly narrowly defined process. The process created a composite score for each waterway's navigation pressure based on service levels as determined by the Canadian Hydrographic Services, freight movement statistics, past work that indicated navigation, and survey scores based on the knowledge of regional managers regarding regionally or important navigable waters. Under these metrics, recreational activities and commercial activities are heightened over and above the natural importance or environmental importance of certain waterways or their relationship to subsistence activities. Thus, I think moving forward, it's critically important to consider how we define or think about navigation. Finally, this question about how the Schedule A list came about speaks to my final point in thinking about how to build in opportunities for more consultation or more transparency into this review process. The origin of Schedule A was of particular interest to our research team, and subsequently we submitted 2 ATIP requests. The first request asked to look at the qualitative assessment of lakes and rivers under review, while our second request asked for the larger quantitative assessment, which marked the first step in the process. However, throughout our research efforts, we weren't actually able to get a full picture of the process as the quantitative assessment was held back due to cabinet confidence. As such, we've had to speculate a little bit about some of the metrics that went into this process. But overall, transparency and clarity appear to be 2 core issues that face this review and the review of the new environmental and regulatory framework as a whole. I think there's a failure in understanding the gaps that exist now within the new legislative framework, and that uncertainty makes it quite difficult to reach an informed consensus about the public comfort or the public expectations for the environmental regulatory regime. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We appreciate your comments on for questioning Mr. Berthold. Ms. Block.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair, and if my questions don't take up the full time, I will share my time with Mr. Berthold. Thank you very much for joining us again this morning. I appreciate the difference, between the Navigation Protection Act and SIA, and the link between in terms of the trigger that used to exist. I want to talk a little bit about the paper that you wrote, titled "Reductions in Federal Oversight of Aquatic Systems in Canada: The Implications of the New Navigation Protection Act." And it had the following three objectives, as I see it. The first being to see how long the average environmental assessment took between 2003 and 2012, what percentage of NWPA-triggered environmental assessments occurred on water bodies listed in the schedule, and finally, what impact the changes to the NPA will have on environmental oversight. And I noted that your paper didn't discuss whether the actual navigation of waterways had been affected. And so I guess my question would be, in your research, were you able to find a single lake or river where navigation was no longer possible as a result of the changes? And you're here testifying before the Transportation Committee on the Navigation Protection Act, and yet your paper didn't discuss that aspect. So I'm just wondering if you could speak to that, please.
Yes, of course. So, I mean, the research project had some limitations, obviously. Key among them was that we were looking at we were looking backwards on projects that had already happened rather than forwards on new data or new projects that were coming on board. And certainly it's that limits our ability to, and the data that we had limited our ability to sort of speculate forward, thinking about, are there any new projects that have come on board that no longer have the navigation piece, or would no longer be covered by NPA. If we were to do this project today, we would have 2 extra years of data that we could actually start to use and see what the implications of NPA specifically has been. However, when we were doing this project, the changes had only just come in place and implementation had not yet occurred. So I can't actually at this point speak to any case of where navigation has been impeded since NPA has been implemented. However, what we can say, based on the data that we had, was that the environmental assessments or the projects that were triggered under NWPA, 58% of those would not be triggered under NPA. Now, as I said, it may still be the case that some of these projects would still see oversight in some capacity or another, either through the Environmental Assessment Act or the Fisheries Act or some other piece of legislation. But I think it's also important for us to potentially distinguish between navigation as one interest or one sort of role for government to play versus environmental assessments, which may be looking at a different set of implications.
Absolutely, which is why we have the 2 acts, right? The one act, the NPA, focuses on navigation, and SIA focuses on environmental assessments. So what I've heard is that your research didn't go beyond 2012 and the changes. So in the past 4 years, you've not done any research on the implications of the changes that were made in 2012 on the waterways here in Canada.
Yeah, that's correct. Mostly because we haven't been able to. I mean, the implementation took some time, and I believe it's only since 2014 that the changes to SIA have come in full effect. So, in thinking about accessing new data, it's only about 2 a year and a half to 2 years that we could begin to start to actually research and look at those impacts over the long term. But from our existing research, what appears to be the case is that 58% of the projects previously triggered would no longer be previously requiring federal review through the Navigable Waters Protection Act would not be considered under even navigation purposes through the NPA.
Thank you. So that's a great segue into my next question. How, in your view, are provincial and federal environmental assessments different? And are two always necessary? I believe that part of the reasoning behind the changes that were made were to reduce the duplication of environmental assessments. So could you comment on how they're different, and are two always necessary?
Short answer.
That's a weighty question, and one that I'm not particularly well equipped to answer. Quite frankly, I'm not as familiar with the provincial sort of regulatory framework and how it intersects with the federal framework. I think this question, though, of federal oversight for navigation purposes and where it falls relative to either provincial environmental regulation or federal environmental regulation is an important question for this committee to consider. Even if it's the case, and I'm not necessarily saying that the triggering mechanism should be reintegrated into a future regulatory framework, but that it's possible that by downloading or requiring the provinces to do their environmental assessments, the role of the federal government on reviewing navigation principles or navigation of waterways is being lost in that mix. And so it's a question of potentially figuring out how to... Sure.
Sorry, Ms. Davis, I'm sorry. I have to interrupt. I've allowed the time to go over because it was an important question that we wanted to get your response to. Mr. Badaway?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I just want to preface my comments by saying how much I appreciate you folks taking time to be a part of this. This study is being undertaken as a way of allowing the public to comment on legislation that's of this importance, so I want to thank you folks for being here. And with that, my first question is that this act is about access and navigation and/or impediments to navigation. I wonder if you can offer your thoughts on the adequacy of the 2012 changes when it comes to artificial or man-made obstructions to navigation.
Sorry, is that directed to me?
One of the two. Jump in.
Why don't you take this, Emma?
Sure. Thank you. I mean, it's hard to assess how a project impacts navigation when a lot of the lakes and rivers aren't being included in the Act. And so, as you know, the schedule focuses on a very small number of lakes and rivers. And so I just don't think that assessment is happening because so many of the lakes and rivers are not under the purview of the Act. And I just have to, I guess related to just the previous question and some of the points that have been raised, I think it's important to flag that the Navigable Waters Protection Program, one of their original goals was environmental protection, and I'll read from the website, the previous website, that it clearly said, and this is a quote from the website, that the Navigable Waters Protection Program is responsible for the protection of the public right to navigation and the protection of the environment through the administration of the Navigable Waters Protection Act. That language has been scaled back since the changes in 2012, but it does say that the program still considers the safety of navigation, access to waterways, recreation and traditional use of navigable waters, and the environmental effects when reviewing a project for approval. So I just want to highlight that people are talking about that this act doesn't have anything to do with environmental protection, but on the website it actually clearly stated that and does still state that. So if that's not the case, that language on that website needs to be changed because that's the public's understanding right now.
And speaking of responsibility, The previous government and Conservative MPs on this committee have repeatedly stated that the smaller MPA means less red tape and greater efficiency for those navigating our waterways. Your opening statement, where both of you indicated that otherwise, quite frankly. Could you please explain why you think the reduced scope of the Act could negatively impact on accessibility in some areas, and how can we fix those problems?
Whoever would like to answer that, Ms. Davidson or Ms. Liu?
In terms of, so I think I think there are two pieces that are intersecting here that are that the committee does need to sort of. Sorry, could you repeat the question? I'm a little confused.
Sure. The previous government and our sitting MPs here from the Conservatives have repeatedly stated that the smaller NPA means less red tape and greater efficiency for those navigating our waterways. You indicated earlier, both of you actually indicated earlier, that otherwise. Can you please explain why you think the reduced scope of the Act would negatively impact on the environment, for example, accessibilities in some areas, and related to some of the comments you had already made with respect to respecting the environment and, of course, what the actual Act is supposed to attach itself to?
Great, thank you. So with respect to reducing red tape in particular, this was one of the pieces that we were quite interested in looking at in our research project because it was part of the rationale under sort of being utilized in the dialogue around the discussions of the MPA changes. I think it is important to note that the number of NWPA triggered EAs accounts for only approximately 5.8% of all of the federal EAs in that 10-year period. So in terms of the overall sort of impact on environmental assessments, it's a relatively small number of all environmental assessments occurring in Canada. Additionally, in terms of the length of the time the environmental assessments took, 53% of environmental assessments triggered by NWPA were complete within 6 months, and 73% were complete within a year.
Thank you.
So the degree to which these environmental assessments were lengthy was not that much.
Thank you. And of course, you think this process is extremely important. And that's what this side of the table
Yes.
is actually trying to do versus the opposite side of the table who are sitting there signing Christmas cards. But at the same time, this is something that's very important. And once again, I do want to express my appreciation to you folks for participating. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Mr. Alban.
Merci, Madame la Présidente.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you to our witnesses for being here this morning. Thank you in particular to Ms. Louis, who for the second time is getting up very early to testify, and we appreciate it. Thank you to my colleagues who agreed to this extra meeting to hear your full testimony. In my questions, I'd like to go from the more general to details. We are dealing with a law which, in your view, is not meeting its goals to correct the situation, especially when it comes to environmental assessments. My question is this. In your view, since you're familiar with the previous act, the Navigable Waters Protection Act, and the current act, the Navigation Protection Act, in your view, is the best way to fix the problem to fix the current act or to go back to the previous one? Ms. Louis, would you like to start?
Thank you, Monsieur Albin. I would say that, I mean, right now I think it's important to revert back to the old act. We need to restore protections because a lot of projects are going forward and being approved without assessment of navigable waterways. But we recognize that the previous act, there was definitely room for improvement. And I would call for the restoration of the act back to the 2012 standards, putting protection protections back on all the lakes and rivers, and then holding a full public consultation on new changes to the Act. So we're seeing public consultations with the Canadian Environmental Assessment Act, which is great, and a lot of cities being visited, and a panel being going to each of the cities to hear people's concerns. So we would ask the same for this act, and I can talk about examples. We wrote a report recently, Every Lake, Every River, Restoring the Navigable Waters Protection Act, where we looked at 4 case studies of projects that were going forward that would have impacts on navigable waters. The Ajax mine in BC is one example, where Jacko Lake, the coffer dam isn't being assessed, which it normally would have been assessed under the old act. And so, the local community has raised serious concerns about what that project is going to do to Jacko Lake. And there's a lot of fly fishing that happens. It's actually termed as the best fly fishing in BC. So there are concrete examples out there. And so just really wanting to underscore that protections need to be put back on right now, and then a fuller consultation process implemented, including a review panel.
Merci. Madame Davidson, vous voulez ajouter quelque chose?
Ms. Davidson, would you like to add anything?
That by returning to the old legislation, I think a lot of the concerns about the regulatory or red tape burden would not be realized, in part because the Navigation Protection Act in its current form no longer triggers the Canadian Environmental Assessment Act. So you would not necessarily get the duplication question around environmental assessment. So you could continue forward with a more robust federal oversight on waterways without actually impacting the degree to which you have to do lengthy or duplicate environmental assessments. Alternatively, one option would be to have sort of a backwards triggering mechanism whereby any environmental assessment that occurs, or any throughout Canada, would trigger a review through the Navigation Protection Act regarding navigability specifically. This would probably keep the overall regulatory burden down relative to, the previous model.
Merci. 2 minutes.
Thank you. I would like to talk about real examples of infrastructure. I think we can all agree that it's not necessary to conduct a 3-year environmental assessment to build a culvert over a stream. But when it comes to big projects, specifically pipelines, Kinder Morgan, or Energy East, the environmental assessment was conducted by an independent agency, namely the National Energy Board. Does this make sense to you? But when we amend this bill, should we not allow the environmental assessment of major projects to be conducted by the Department of Transportation? Ms. Louis.
Has the responsibility, and I'd say also a lot of the expertise that is needed to conduct this type of assessment. It's no secret that there's a lot of concerns about the National Energy Board and it being co-opted possibly by the energy industry, and so just raising questions and concerns about its actual independence. And so I think really the federal government does have the responsibility to do this, and really needing to think about how navigable waterways are impacted. So I would hate to see the department not have a role or responsibility in protecting these waterways.
Thank you very much, Mr. Alban.
Sorry.
Okay, Mr. Hardy.
Oh, thank you, Madam Chair, and thanks to our witnesses, especially from British Columbia, because I know how early it is out there. And we'll start with you, Ms. Louis. You are aware, of course, that both the Trans Mountain Line and Line 3 are following existing corridors, so it's not as though we're blazing a new trail through the wilderness on those. And I'm wondering if your group has any information in terms of the performance of the existing pipelines in those two places. And if you don't, that's fine. But if you have any sort of background information about how they have performed with respect to spills, accidents, etc., do you have that kind of information at hand?
Well, I know that I don't have that information on hand, though I can certainly get it to you quite quickly.
Oh, good. I would ask you.
I do.
Sorry, ma'am. I'd ask you to keep your answers short. I know the two of you are just brimming with information, but I have a few questions I need to get in there. Okay, that's fine. Let's talk about, and I wanted to build on Mr. Aubin's question because. Having been involved in the other side of this study, and that is on the Fisheries and Oceans Committee, I too asked the same question of the pipeline industry with respect to the National Energy Board versus the DFO being involved in environmental assessments. So you mentioned that transport should do it. Other people believe it should be DFO. There's actually a compelling reason for the NEB to continue to do what they do. Do you have any preference? I think you signaled one, but I just wanted to give you an opportunity to say, why you want what you think should be in place. That was to you, Ms.
I mean, I would say. Yes, thank you. I would say that, if it comes to navigable waters, that it would be Transport Canada. I think there needs to be better coordination amongst the federal departments, in that there is obviously overlap in some of the projects that, there's an obvious link between navigation and fisheries, and we've raised concerns about some of the projects impacting not just boating or recreational paddling, but also it affects fishing as well. And so I think that it's not either or. In some cases, it might actually need to be both. I think it would depend on a case-by-case basis, but we can't do that assessment if the Navigation Protection Act doesn't even look at most of the lakes and rivers in Canada.
Now, one thing further on the NEB process, this was highlighted in another meeting that I was in, is that rather than just looking at potential environmental impacts during the construction period, that in fact the NEB oversees the environmental performance, if you will, of a pipeline for its whole life. That there's ongoing inspection and there's ongoing concern with that. It's just something that to tuck away as a wrinkle that may speak to keeping the NEB as part of that process. Ms. Davidson, we have heard you say, and in fact both of you say, that triggering an environmental assessment through the NPA or the Navigable Waters Protection Act, if we go back there, is still kind of the preferred way you'd see to go, or are there other trigger mechanisms that you would want us to be thinking about? And again, I'd ask you to keep your answer fairly short. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Yeah. I'm not sure that the triggering mechanism is necessarily the best way forward. I think the biggest thing to think about, though, is at the moment we're not totally clear, and the public isn't clear on what gaps exist under this framework as compared to the previous framework. And it's difficult for us to reach a consensus on what that looks like, or on what the Canadian public is comfortable with under the new framework.
There was, of course, obvious concern by the previous government about, the buildup of reviews. There was something like 3,000 in the lineup for review by the DFO alone, and it took a long time to get them through. In the meantime, important public works were held up, made more expensive, etc. Quick open question to both of you. What would you say, what would you recommend in terms of perhaps streamlining this so that we're not holding people back from things that the public needs?
I would actually just have to ask members of the committee to rethink about the way that this is being framed. So I know there's a lot of talk about red tape and recognize that there are infrastructure projects that need to go forward, but we're also, I ask you to think about what we're trying to protect here, and that's water. That's people's drinking water. That's a source of people's livelihood. If people can't fish, there's a lot of communities that rely on that for their jobs, and it's also needed for watersheds and people's drinking water. And so I would actually think it's quite important actually to take our time and to make sure that projects aren't going to negatively impact waterways, because I know that if we hold up pipelines, a potential spill, as we saw with the Husky oil spill in Saskatchewan, that directly impacted. We knew people in those communities that weren't able to drink their water for a number of days. So I would actually ask members of the committee to really rethink about that we actually need some of these safeguards, and we need to take our time to make sure that projects aren't going to be impacting people's drinking water.
Very much, Ms. Liu. On to Mr. Fraser.
I think my colleague has a quick question to begin.
Okay, Mr. Iacono.
Bonjour, bon matin, on va dire.
Good morning. In your opinion, what are possible legislative solutions which would allow us to balance environmental protection and the protection of people's right to navigation?
Désolé. Selon
In your view, what are possible legislative solutions which might allow us to strike a balance between the protection of the environment and the protection of the public's right to navigation?
If I'm understanding the question correctly, I would say that it's protecting the public's right to navigation is oftentimes protecting the environment. And so I think that oftentimes we see projects, and I'll refer back to the report that we recently released, but we saw a very intimate link between protecting water itself and then navigation, because I raised the example of the Kalamazoo spill or even the Husky oil spill, where people weren't able to navigate the waterways, and then that's obviously linked to environmental protection as well. And so one recommendation we had was just including right now the Act, and even previously the Act didn't include any sort of assessment on potential spills, and that can definitely impact waterways. And so I would ask that a new clause be included in the Act, so that when there is an assessment on a project, that it looks at what a potential spill could do to navigation and the environment as well.
Ms. Louis, just on the clause you mentioned, is it your vision that clause would apply to every waterway that an energy project crosses? So if there's a major pipeline project, no matter the size, or just when the review takes place?
Well, the hope is that so right now the legislation doesn't look at any pipelines, and so one of our asks is that it also look at pipelines again, and then absolutely, I think we'd want to know the risks of if it were going to be a spill or if it was a mining project. Important to look at how some sort of discharge or water pollution would impact navigation.
Okay, Ms. Davidson, perhaps this is a question for you, although I'll open it up. One of the complaints that we heard previously is that although the public's right to navigation is still protected under the common law, going to court to seek a remedy is not a possibility for many of the users of waterways. Is it your view that an administrative complaints process that would be more efficient and cheaper would be a good thing?
It's not something I've looked at, and so I don't feel like I'm prepared to comment on that specifically. I think it's a question for the committee. Do we want to create a regulatory framework that is forward-facing or a complaints process that is backwards-facing? And that's something I think that this committee should be thinking about moving forward.
So if we were to have a forward-facing regulatory framework, one of the issues that I see popping up is it's not necessarily that difficult for a provincial government or a municipality to have a waterway added, but again, for the user of a waterway, they don't necessarily have the authority to get a waterway added to the list. Should we be expanding the ability of the actual end users of waterways to have their waterways added to the list if they can make the case that it's sensible?
Well, I think this speaks back to how the schedule was initially constructed, which was really around commercial use and heavy navigation use for recreational activities. It would be a time-consuming process to do so, but engaging with communities, engaging with Indigenous groups, engaging with perhaps individuals who were not able to participate in the previous process to construct a list that was a little bit more comprehensive might be one way forward. It should also be noted that the two-step process of the schedule, the initial sort of quantitative assessment came up with a list of 1,070 potential lists to be included on the schedule. That was whittled down through the qualitative assessment to around 240. So there was already, there's a larger list out there that could also be considered as a starting point again when thinking about the schedule.
And very quickly, I don't have much time left, in trying to build a list that more adequately protects the traditional use by Indigenous communities and those in the north, is there any advice you have to ensure that those voices are heard so we can protect their traditional use of waterways?
I think in those cases, and maybe you could piggyback onto the current SIA consultations, but you do have to engage in a nation-to-nation consultation with those groups and actually have them at the table while you're preparing that list. I think it's quite notable that if you look at the territories, there are barely any rivers or lakes being protected, and many of those rivers are used for navigation, for recreation, and for subsistence on a regular basis.
Madam Chair, do I have any time remaining?
We're expired here.
Thank you very much.
6:07. All right. I want to say thank you to our witnesses, especially Ms. Liu for your early hour and for you coming back again the second time. Very much appreciated. Thank you to the witnesses. We will now go to complete this session and to...
I actually have a point of order.
Yes, Mr. Secan.
Just trying to figure out...
Can I just complete it for our witnesses? Thank you very much for your participation. We appreciate that very much. Mr. Secan?
Guys, just had a question for the clerk. I'm trying to schedule the next session, and I was wondering when we got our plane for, when we go up north.
We don't have authority from the House to travel, so I cannot make any financial commitment that would involve the aircraft.
What does that mean? We don't have authority from the House.
So you haven't been able to book the aircraft, which we knew was going to take some time?
Yes.
Right. Until we have approval.
Yes, the budget is not active, if you will, until the House says we can travel.
I thought it was approved.
No.
If I may?
The liaison committee, it went through that process, but at the end, it still requires House approval from all of the parties. It requires unanimous consent, and evidently it's not, at this particular time, has not been dealt with in that way, so.
It hasn't been dealt with, or it hasn't received unanimous consent?
It hasn't received unanimous consent. I'm not even sure if it's been asked. It's been talked about maybe within the system, but as the clerk said, we don't have unanimous consent right now. We don't have approval, period. So until we get approval, you're not able to book the flight or do any of the other logistics.
Or look at the concerns of the North. Nice.
All right. I'm sorry, Mr. Secan, I didn't hear you.
I'm just saying the premier that came down, is he not expecting us to come up?
The clerk will inform them that we're not able to go at this particular time.
Madam Chair, if I can ask, I thought we, unanimous consent, I'm assuming, is the three parties. I thought that we had already discussed this to nail down a date. So who in this room is not in support of us going? Because I was under the impression that before it went to the House, we had unanimous consent.
But it takes more than just the folks that are sitting in this room. Mr. Berthold, we need to move on.
We're still in public.
We're still in public session here.
If I may, to respond to Mr. Badaway, I just want to remind everyone that there was no unanimous consent on the committee. I think the NDP and the official opposition voted against the trip. We'd held a vote, and you across were in favor.
I'm going to move that we go in camera. Okay, Mr. Berthold, the floor is back to you again. Okay. Sorry, Mr. Berthold, I didn't mean to cut you off.
you.